The fifth and final season of Stranger Things has officially started, and it may come as no surprise that I'm a fan of the show. Many years ago, while watching season 3, I for some reason decided to Google if Stranger Things was inspired by any true events. Come to find out, the Duffer Brothers did say that the show was inspired by something called the Montauk Project. This is one of those government conspiracy theories, and after reading about it, I actually went down multiple rabbit holes. I found out that some claim the Montauk Project was a continuation of MK Ultra, just more extreme and more off the books, so to speak. I also read about a ship disappearing during what was called the Philadelphia experiment. This video is the second part to my series about the real-life Stranger Things, and in today's video, I'll be diving into the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment. So let's put on our tinfoil hats, and as Peter Moon stated in regards to someone else's personal account of the Montauk Project, quote, "While it is indeed healthy to remain skeptical, it is equally healthy to keep an open mind," end quote. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Also welcome to part 2 of my series discussing I guess you could say the real life Stranger Things. And in part 1, which I recommend you watching, I spoke about Camp Hero, a brief overview of the Montauk Project along with MK Ultra. And the Montauk Project is said to be a continuation, allegedly, of course, a continuation of MK Ultra, but it was a little bit more underground and a little more dangerous in nature with all the experiments that they allegedly did. Now, with all of that said, I do have to issue a disclaimer that all of this is just for entertainment and I guess kind of for educational purposes. I'm not claiming any of this as fact, so of course this is all alleged, but I do just find it interesting, and I think that some of my regular viewers of my channel will also find it interesting. I'm also a huge fan of Stranger Things, so that's another reason why I wanted to cover this topic. And I know that at the time of this recording, the new season and the final season has not come out yet. But by the time that I put this up, yes, it would have already started. Hello, Editing Monica here. I just wanted to say that if I get anything wrong, or if anybody has any suggestions on more rabbit holes to go down, links to other sources, please leave it in the comment section below. Or if, like I said, if I get anything wrong, please correct it also in the comment section below, because this is such an extensive topic to cover. In addition to that, YouTube usually hides comments that has links in them, so I'll make sure to do my best to look at the held comments that YouTube will have in that folder, and I will approve them as they get added in there. But anyway, back to the video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go more in depth about the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project, because both of these things intertwine with one another. There are two separate topics, but they tie into one another, as I just said, obviously. But the two books that I really went deep in with this topic is this one by Preston Nichols, and this one, there's a section where Bielek talks about the Philadelphia experiment. I will leave these linked below in case you want to go ahead and read them. But I got most of, if not all of my information for this portion of the video from those books, because unfortunately, since this is all alleged, we really only have firsthand accounts to listen to and everything of that nature. So, without further ado, I've rambled quite a bit. Without further ado, let's just get right into it. The Montauk Project was a theory that started circulating in the 1980s, and this was thanks to two men by the name of Preston Nichols and Bielek. The way that I'm going to structure this part of the video is not in chronological order. I'm going to go over Bielek's story about the Philadelphia experiment first, and then I'll go into the Montauk Project and Preston Nichols' experience with that. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I did also just want to say that even though I'm presenting information about the Philadelphia experiment from first-hand accounts, there is an article I found that stated the Eldridge wasn't in the Philadelphia shipyard in October of 1943, but it was actually in the New York shipyard in October of 1943. Then there's another article that states the following, quote, As per Edward Dungeon, who was aboard the USS Engstrom, USS Eldridge was carrying classified devices on board, none of which is a teleportation device. Dungeon was in dry dock aboard another destroyer, the USS Engstrom, when the event took place. The Eldridge was in fact using an amplified degaussing technique to try and scramble the ship's magnetic signature. It was hoped that this system would protect the ship from sea mines that could detect a ship's magnetic field as it passed over or near the mine. Contrary to Hollywood movies, most torpedoes didn't hit the sides of ships, they detonated underneath them with a magnetic trigger that could sense the ship's magnetic signature. It was hoped that this degaussing method might also throw off torpedoes as well. Then they go ahead and talk about the green glow that was around the ship, and it says, quote, "The green glow was probably due to an electric storm or St. Elmo's fire. As for Eldridge's mysterious appearance in Norfolk and sudden return to Philadelphia, Dungeon explained that the Navy used inland canals off limits to commercial vessels to make the trip in 6 hours rather than 2 days." End quote. With all of that being said, it is up to you, the viewer, to decide what you think about the Philadelphia experiment. But it's still an interesting story to tell, and who really knows what the truth is behind all of this? But let's go ahead and talk about the story from Al Bielek and Preston Nichols' point of view. According to Preston Nichols' book, the Montauk Project goes all the way back to 1943 when radar and visibility was being researched. Their research took place on the USS Eldridge. Due to the Eldridge being stationed at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, anything that happened to the ship would be called the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment was also known as the Rainbow Project to the people who were behind this project. This was top secret, and it would supposedly end World War II, and that's because the experimentation that was happening was making a ship invisible to enemy radar. This would be done by using an electromagnetic bottle, which would divert waves around the ship. Well, even though they were just trying to figure out a way to make this ship undetectable to radar, things took a turn for the worse, and the ship became invisible to the naked eye and then left the space-time continuum. Not too long after the ship came back, it was actually in Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away from its original spot, which was Philadelphia. So I guess you can say technically the project was successful, however, it was not for the people involved. The surviving crew was in such a state of disorientation that would actually be the reason they would be discharged for being mentally unfit, while the rest had been planted into the bulkheads of the ship itself. With the crew being discharged as mentally unfit, this would obviously make whatever stories they told as discredited, and obviously nobody's going to believe them if they're deemed mentally unfit. The Rainbow Project was at a standstill at this point, and according to the book, the Rainbow Project would start up again in the late 1940s. Then it would lead to a hole being ripped through time and space at Montauk in 1983. Quote, "I believe that the experiment with the invisible ship did take place and that it was a disaster to the men involved. The government does not like to admit such mistakes, and that could be the reason why the official story has never been released. As for the brains behind the experiment, I believe that Nikola Tesla devised the apparatus before he died. Tesla had more experience than anybody else in the world in the field of high-energy physics, and his experiments in 1900, producing artificial light on a large scale, has never been duplicated to this day. It has been said that he was 100 years ahead of his time, and his inventions dealing with electricity definitely indicated he was thinking into the far future." End quote. Now, it wasn't until 1989, specifically in Phoenix, Arizona, at the UFO New Age conference, that Al Bielek would come forward and not only say that he was a part of the Philadelphia experiment, But obviously, he was a survivor of the Philadelphia experiment. Al had claimed that the beginning stages of the experiment started in Chicago in 1931. The team of scientists that had started working on invisibility consisted of John Hutchinson, the dean of the University of Chicago, Nikola Tesla, and Dr. Emil Kurtenauer, an Austrian who had a PhD degree in physics. According to Al, quote, "Although it was a private research operation, it was apparently funded by the Navy from the very beginning. It was soon moved to the East Coast and wound up at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, which had been formed in 1933. Einstein and a number of very interesting people became associated with the Institute. But one of the first, and perhaps one of the youngest members that they had joined them in 1933 was Dr. John Eric von Neumann." End quote. Nikola Tesla had also allegedly rejoined the program in the late 1930s. Nikola Tesla had been assigned to several government projects, one of which was the Philadelphia experiment. According to Al, even though Tesla had been part of the experiment and also he was the first director of the experiment, Al believed that the best contributor to this project was actually Dr. John von Neumann. The ironic part about all of this is that Al Bielek actually started researching the Philadelphia experiment in the 1960s as just a research project. He had no idea at the time of starting his research that he was a part of the project itself. Al Bielek claimed that he had lived a double life. One as Alfred Bielek and one as Edward A. Cameron. His brother was Duncan Cameron, and they were the sons of Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who was a wealthy ex-Navy man. Now, remember the name Duncan Cameron because it will come up later in Preston Nichols' as part of his story. According to Al, his brother Duncan had gotten his PhD in physics from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and Al got his PhD in physics at Harvard. But this is when he was living his life as Edward Cameron. Unfortunately, Al didn't have documented proof of his time in the school as Edward, but he had flashbacks to classes and professors. Edward and Duncan had joined a naval officers training program because of their father, and in September of 1939, they were assigned to Providence, Rhode Island at the officers training school. Then, in September of 1940, Edward and Duncan applied coils and generators to a minesweeper and accomplished a successful transition to invisibility. When Al was asked about how there was a successful invisibility experiment prior to the Philadelphia experiment, he said, quote, "Yes, but we used no personnel on board the minesweeper. We used only the ship. The experiment was heavily classified, of course," end quote. Al would go on to say that while he lived as Edward, he wasn't concerned being around all of the powerful electromagnetic and radio frequency fields. However, someone who was concerned was Nikola Tesla. This was because he had found that the next invisibility experiment would involve actual people, which would be the crew aboard the USS Eldridge. Al believed that Tesla had some kind of extraterrestrial connection because of how much knowledge he had, and maybe Tesla had talked to said being every day. Eventually, Nikola Tesla told the Navy to give the project that would be known as the Philadelphia experiment a little more time, but because there was a war going on, he was told to just make it work. In March of 1942, they used a test ship to make it invisible, but nothing happened. Al would go on to say that he thinks Tesla deliberately sabotaged the experiment because he didn't want to do the actual experiment on human lives, which we all know how that went anyway when they went ahead and did the experiment without Nikola Tesla. So if this is in fact true, Nikola Tesla's suspicions were correct. 10 months after the failed experiment on January 7th, 1943, Nikola Tesla was found dead in his hotel room. Al Bielek said that he and his brother Duncan were both concerned when Nikola had left the project because they knew they would be the human subjects on the ship when it would be time to experiment with actual people on the ship. And this is when Al was living his life as Edward. I know, it gets a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try my best to kind of make sense here, but Al and Edward are the same person. It's just Al was the person who didn't know about the experiment, and Edward was the one in the experiment. So hopefully, like I said, I'm going to do my best to not confuse everybody here. Once Tesla left, Dr. Newman was in charge, and on July 20th, they were ready for the experiment. Following on July 22nd, when they flipped the main switch and the USS Eldridge had gone invisible to radar and visual contact for 20 minutes. Al had said that after that 20 minutes, when they came back, because this is in his words, obviously, quote, "We returned 20 minutes later with most of the crew demented. My brother and I must have been spared because we were in the hold, and much of the experiment was on deck. In the spite of heavy loss of personnel to hysteria and near insanity, we were given 21 days to try it again. This time, they told us we would try only for radar invisibility, not optical invisibility. After all, the most important thing was to confuse enemy radar. It was not really necessary to be invisible. Besides, what if invisible ships started ramming into each other with the radar ineffective? On August 12th, with the new crew, the experiment began afresh. For 60 to 70 seconds, the Eldridge was invisible to radar. Then there was a blue flash and the ship disappeared. There was not even a waterline to mark its invisible presence. It was gone. For 4 hours, it was gone." End quote. You might be wondering where Al and his brother Duncan went or what happened to them within that 4 hours. Since they saw the crewmen going crazy, they decided to jump off the ship. Here's the part of the story that gets interesting. They didn't land in the water. They somehow landed at the Montauk base, and Dr. Newman was already waiting for both of them. It was 1983, but somehow Dr. Newman died in 1957. So Al and Duncan somewhat or somehow traveled into the future. According to Al, quote, "And guess what had been pulled along with us? Between August 4th and August 12th, we had sighted UFOs hovering over the Eldridge. Well, a UFO was sucked along with us to Montauk and it was dismantled there," end quote. According to Al, even though him and Duncan had made it through the experiment unscathed, he did believe it had to do with them being in the hold. However, he believed that if they would have done this experiment one day earlier or later, the crewmen wouldn't have been hurt the way that they were. The date was significant because one of the most important pieces of equipment that they had with them on the Eldridge was that of Tesla's zero-time generator. Quote, "This incredible device was created to lock into the basic zero time of our galaxy. It provides a physical, cosmological lockup that must be in place before one can attempt any exotic experiments in teleportation, invisibility, or whatever," end quote. Al claimed that the UFOs were trying to tell humans not to attempt the experiment on August 12th. This was due to the Earth's biorhythm and how there is a 20-year peak that occurred on that specific year and date, August 12th, 1943. That's why they were pulled into space and traveled 40 years into the future. Quote, "As Dr. Newman explained, what he needed in 1943 to assure the experiment's success was a computer. Each individual has his own individual time lock reference. When this reference is disrupted by extreme power, people can literally be torn away from their moments in time and drift away into another point of time. Although von Neumann believed that he had correctly calculated the zero-time reference, only a computer could have done so for each crewman. Therefore, some of the men did not come back to the precise moment in the past or present of 1943 in which they had left, and they only had to be off by a millisecond to find themselves embedded in a steel bulkhead. Others were glowing. Most of the rest were insane. Only those shielded by steel walls or decking survived," end quote. According to Al, the Eldridge went on to perform another experiment around October 27th, but this time there were no people aboard the ship. The ship would end up becoming damaged, but returned to duty until 1946. Then in 1951, the Eldridge was transferred to the Greek Navy. There was an experiment like this performed with a plane, which was successful, but a year later, the pilot had gone up with someone and somehow the pilot disappeared from the cockpit. And since the person that was brought into the plane was not a pilot, the jet crashed. Only one body was recovered from the crash, and it wasn't the pilot's. The pilot just disappeared, never to be seen again. Al Bielek claims that his brother Duncan was pulled back to 1983, and he died within 3 days due to old age. This was due to him aging about a year an hour. Duncan's soul was introduced to a body that was born in 1951 because supposedly secret government agencies are able to put souls from previous physical bodies that had passed into new bodies. For some unknown reason to Al, him and his brother were not able to die. They had to be kept alive somehow. Now, when Al was Edward, he was somehow assigned, I guess you could say, to the background and the body of Al Bielek, who was born in 1927. So you might be wondering, how did Al Bielek come to figure out that he was Edward Cameron in a previous life? Especially because he was researching the Philadelphia experiment in the 1960s and everything of that nature. But the reasoning behind it, if you for some reason guess brainwashing, that is the answer. It's because he was brainwashed. Allegedly, of course. And this brings me to 1985 when Al Bielek would go ahead and visit Montauk. And then in 1988, there was actually a movie that came out about the Philadelphia experiment, and that would trigger something within Al's brain or his memories or whatever that would kind of just bring everything back and remind him of his previous life. After Al had this revelation, I guess you can call it, he called Duncan Cameron, his brother, or who he believed was his brother, and he ended up talking to him about it, and he said that you're actually my brother, and he explained all of this to him, and Duncan Cameron said, yeah, I knew all of this, I was just waiting for you to figure it all out. Now, there is a lot more to Al Bielek's story, and it has to do with UFOs and extraterrestrials and all of that kind of stuff, but that could be a whole video of itself because there's just so much more information, especially in the book that I got Al's story from. But yeah, so there's obviously more things that are tied to it from Al's side, but I did just want to give kind of like a brief overview. So obviously there's more that could be tied to Al's story. So if you're interested in that video, let me know in the comment section below. And yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is that of the Montauk Project.
Good morning, people. You already know who I am. I think we'll say at this point that our purpose here is not to prove whether or not this project happened. What we are here is to discuss what they did, how they did it. Mr. Bielek already discussed very well what they did. So we'll go into the meat of it. Essentially, the Montauk Project was a very large mind amplifier. That's essentially all it was. I have here a very simplified block diagram.
Get back up on the platform and get you.
Well, the trouble is I'm having trouble seeing the diagram.
Okay, go ahead.
I can be right here. All right. Very simplified was essentially a transmitter. We had an input network, which was the Montauk Chair, that's what we called it. Mr. Cameron, sitting over there in the red shirt, was the psychic that sat in the Montauk Chair and fed information into the computer system. The computer system essentially processed the computer system essentially processed the information and spit it out to the transmitter. We had two transmitters, drove one of two antennas. There was also a Delta T antenna and a 100 kilowatt noise amplifier. This was the basic outlay of the Montauk system.
While I may not I may not believe all of this 100%, like every single fine detail, but there's a lot of things that make me go, you know what? MK Ultra was a thing, and the government destroyed a bunch of the documents from that. And there's a lot of things that I'm sure the government isn't telling us, and obviously all alleged, but I'm sure that there's stuff that they don't tell us. And that's why it makes me think, like, okay, maybe, is it all really that far-fetched? I'm not saying that all of this is true or anything like that, but just the idea behind it, the idea behind doing human experiments and trying to figure out time travel and things of that nature. I mean, I really would not be surprised if this was, if the Montauk Project was an actual thing. And because if it's supposed to be a continuation of MK Ultra, I mean, they destroyed a bunch of documents from MK Ultra, so who's to say, I'm pretty sure I said this either at the beginning of this video or in part one, but who's to say that they just didn't learn their lesson, so to speak, from the first part of the experiment, I guess you can say, and now they were being a little more safe with how they were doing these experiments, how they were kind of keeping it hush-hush, things of that nature. But again, all alleged, not saying that any of this is fact. I just putting on my tinfoil hat here. Before we get into Preston Nichols' involvement with the Montauk Project, I did want to kind of give a little bit of a background on Preston Nichols himself, just because I think he's kind of an interesting dude. I mean, rest in peace, he's no longer with us, but I think he was very interesting. Even if he was the mad scientist type, is what I call it, I still find him interesting. So let's go ahead and get into a little bit of the background behind Preston Nichols. So let's take it back to 1971, and this is where Preston Nichols had been working for a company called AIL, or Airborne Instruments Laboratory. I so badly want to pronounce laboratory as laboratory because of Dexter's Laboratory. Anyway, throughout his years, Preston would obtain a degree in electrical engineering and became a specialist in electromagnetic phenomena. So this next part, I want to read word for word from his book, and because some of this is a little much and a lot of technical terms, so I'm just going to read it directly from his book. But he said, I continued to research in my spare time and collaborated with different physics to test and monitor their various responses. In 1974, I noticed a peculiar phenomenon that was common to all of the physics that I worked with. Every day, at the same hour, their minds would be jammed. They couldn't think effectively. Suspecting that the interference was caused by an electronic signal, I used my radio equipment and correlated what came on over the airwaves at the times the physics were non-functional. Whenever a 410 to 420 megahertz cycle appeared on the air, they were jammed. When the 410 to 420 cycle was off, the physics would open back up after about 20 minutes. It was obvious that the signal was greatly impeding the ability of the physics. I decided to trace this signal. Placing a modified TV antenna on the roof of my car, I grabbed a VHF receiver and set out looking for the source of it. I tracked it right to Montauk Point. It was coming directly from a red and white radar antenna on the Air Force Base, which is the red and white antenna that you see in all the pictures, although now I don't think it's actually red and white anymore. I think it's kind of faded by now, and nature kind of reclaimed a lot of the base. But anyway, let's keep going. At first, I thought this signal might have been generated accidentally. I checked around and found out that the base was still active. Unfortunately, security was tight and the guards wouldn't give any useful information. They said that the radar was for a project run by the FAA. I couldn't press the point beyond that. In fact, their statement didn't make a lot of sense. This was a World War II radar defense system known as SAGE radar. It was totally antiquated, and there is not any known reason why the FAA would need such a system. I didn't believe them, but couldn't help being intrigued. Unfortunately, I had hit a dead end. This was until 1984, when one of Preston Nichols' friends let him know that Montauk was now abandoned So he should just go ahead and check it out. So, of course, Preston Nichols went ahead and took a look. The weird thing of how the base was abandoned was there were papers that were kind of scattered all over the place. And that's not how the military would normally leave a base. They would normally wipe everything and all of that. But yeah, he was finding documents all over the floor. And I actually have a story about this. Not about Montauk, but there's a video that I did many, many years ago. I think this is going back 5 or 6 years now. But about Greystone. And Greystone was located in my home state of New Jersey, but they actually demolished the building. And there may or may not have been a time in my younger years, this is going back, I don't know, 20 years now or something, where my now husband and I decided to take a little peek around the old Greystone, and it was the same thing. There were medical records scattered all over the place. There were pictures of patients scattered all over the place, and it looked like they had just abandoned it. And yeah, I thought that was kind of strange too, because I mean, these are people's medical records. And I mean, I know that we have HIPAA laws and stuff now, but I don't know, it was just kind of weird to see it all just kind of scattered all over the place. And this is all alleged, of course, but I mean, this was also a very long time ago. But anyway, so going back to Preston Nichols and the Montauk project and going on the base and just kind of looking around. So when he was looking around, he did see a lot of equipment that kind of he was interested in, and he wanted to see if he could take it home. And there, I'm going to insert the clip here, but there's a documentary or interview, whatever you want to call it, that they did with Preston Nichols, and they showed kind of all the equipment that he had in his house. It was just everywhere. So of course, Preston just really enjoyed this type of, I guess you can call it technology or whatever you really want to call it. But instead of just taking equipment while he was exploring the base, Preston Nichols did go ahead and go through the proper people or the proper channels, whatever you want to call it, to be able to get some of this equipment. You know, like, hey, it's not being used. Is there any way that I could take it? Because for whatever he wanted to use it for. I mean, even if it was just to have it in his house, because he really enjoyed this stuff. Now, even though Preston Nichols didn't just take the equipment and he asked if he could take some of the equipment, there was a lot of back and forth. And the reason why was because when it came to the equipment, some of the equipment, they weren't really sure who it belonged to at that point in time. Then Preston's contact told him to go ahead and talk to a man from Bayonne, New Jersey, who would be able to kind of help him retrieve some of the equipment that he was asking to take. This is where the story gets interesting. So this mysterious man from Bayonne gave Preston some kind of paperwork stating that he could take this equipment and that it didn't belong to anybody and that it was abandoned. But he also told Preston that the caretaker of Montauk Air Force Base would show him around, and his name was Mr. Anderson. When Preston made it to the base, Mr. Anderson told him he could take anything he wanted during his trip, but that he'd have to kick him out if he came back a second time. Preston brought a man named Brian with him who was a psychic. Brian had helped Preston with some of his research, and Preston and Brian had decided to go into two separate directions. I'm assuming to cover more ground in less time, and Preston had stumbled upon what seemed to be a homeless man. The man had been living at the abandoned base for a while, and he was talking about how there was an experiment that happened that was absolutely horrible, and he hadn't gotten over it himself. He also spoke about a beast that had appeared, and this is just a little tidbit, like a little side note, but when they talk about the beast, it reminds me of in Stranger Things. It reminds me of the Demogorgons and all of the stuff in the Upside Down and like Vecna and all of that. This man had also said that he knew Preston and that Preston had been part of the project himself. But Preston had no idea who this homeless person was. He ended up going back and finding Brian, and he asked him for a psychic reading because Brian had also felt something really weird on the base. Quote, his reading was strangely similar to what the homeless man had just told me. He spoke of irregular weather patterns, mind control, and a vicious beast. He mentioned animals being affected, crashing through windows. Mind control was a main focus of Brian's reading, end quote. To make things even weirder for Preston was a few weeks later, another mysterious man had barged into his lab that he had at home, and what he was saying was similar to that of Brian's psychic readings and the homeless man at Montauk. Because it was weird for two complete strangers to Preston to know who he was and that their stories had somehow lined up with one another, he decided to look into Montauk and what his actual involvement was. Preston would go into town and ask the locals questions about the area or any weird occurrences. 6 people had told him it snowed in the middle of August, but hurricane-like winds would come out of nowhere, and thunderstorms, lightning, and hail were considered unusual occurrences. Anyway, locals also talked about the animals acting weird and coming to town in masses, sometimes even crashing through windows. Preston did state that he believed that the big radar reflector on top of the tower that you see in all of the pictures was used to beam mood control functions. Even the chief of police had something odd to say. There were strange things that would happen all the time, but one of these would be crimes being committed in a specific 2-hour window. Then there wouldn't be any crime. Was this all some kind of weather pattern control and mind control thing? I mean, anything is possible, but I'll let you be the judge of these claims. Something that Peter Moon stated in his commentary at this point in Preston's story was, quote, while it is indeed healthy to remain skeptical, it is equally healthy to keep an open mind, end quote. In November of 1984, a man by the name of Duncan Cameron, which in Peter Moon's commentary, he said he actually met Duncan as well, but he had a piece of audio equipment that he had asked Preston to help him with. Preston had brought up bringing Duncan to a location that may seem familiar to him. Well, to no surprise, Duncan knew more about Montauk than originally expected. He knew exactly where everything was, and when they had gone into the transmitter building... Oh, and I forgot to say this earlier. Remember Mr. Anderson, the caretaker of Montauk, and how he told Preston that he would have to kick him out if he came back a second time? Well, he also told Preston that he takes a break at 7 p.m. every night, which we all know what that's code for. Anyway, Duncan and Preston went into the transmitter building, and Duncan went into some kind of a weird trance. He kept repeating the same things over and over again. Eventually, they figured out through some memory unblocking techniques Preston used on Duncan that Duncan was sent to become friends with Preston, then to kill him and blow up his lab. Obviously, Duncan didn't do that since they figured out he was programmed by someone and had started working for Preston instead. In July of 1986, Preston Nichols decided to share information about Montauk to the USPA, the United States Psychotronics Association, during a speech. After this, Preston decided to go to the federal government with this information. He had a contact who was a nephew of a senior senator from the Southwest, Senator Goldwater. The senator saw documents that Preston had collected from the base that had orders on it that was evidence that the base was still operating after it was supposedly decommissioned in 1969. The senator did visit the base to investigate himself, and even though he was a government official, the people guarding the base weren't fans of him coming to try and investigate. Eventually, the senator completed his investigation and found that he couldn't find any trace of any type of government funding to the base during the time that these experiments were happening. With all of these weird things happening to Preston and people recognizing him, something just didn't feel right. Almost as if he was living 2 different realities or 2 different timelines, so to speak. In 1989, at the one company he worked at, there was a room that was closed off and only a few people had clearance to go into this room. Then one day, it had to be cleaned out. So of course, Preston took this as his opportunity to go in there and kind of discover a few things, but he said that there were imprints where things once stood. So, I mean, like, shelves and stuff like that, or desks, whatever. And he did also say that he saw an elevator, but unfortunately, when he tried to get into the elevator, I guess some kind of alarm or something had gone off. So security came, and they already weren't very big fans of Preston and the questions that he was asking about the room. Out of nowhere, band-aids would appear on Preston's hands, and he had no idea where they were coming from. He started going to the company nurse and asking her if he had gotten the Band-Aid from her, and she would say there's no record of him going to her and asking for a Band-Aid. Well, he asked enough to alert security again, and they had come to Preston asking him, why are you asking all these questions and things like that. He knew that he needed to kind of calm it down a little bit with the questioning and the investigating, because it clearly seemed as though maybe somebody was kind of on to him at that point, or they were kind of worried about all the questions that he was asking. But that wasn't until he heard about Project Moonbeam. And apparently there was something that was high security within the basement of the company that he was working for, and he was able to somehow get through security. So, with Preston being able to get through security, he walked into a really nice office. And in that office, there was a nameplate that said Preston B. Nichols, Assistant Project Director. As I'm sure most people would feel about this, but he knew that even though this was a big major discovery, he knew that he couldn't take any of the documentation that was at his desk or even just snoop around a lot or whatever, because he knew that this could also alert security, or this could be cause for concern if something was out of order or something was disheveled, and then everything just kind of comes crashing down. But while he was in this office, he decided to try and memorize as much as he could that was in his office. There were a few days that went by, and Preston didn't want to go down into this portion of the company that he worked for, or his assistant director office, but he didn't want to look suspicious, so he waited a few days before he went down there again. And when he got through security, they had stated that they had someone who wanted to speak with Preston. And they had asked him, what are you doing down here? What's going on? And he said that he was going to his office. Well, that's when they told him, you don't have an office down here. So he told them, no, that's the room where my office is. And when they opened it up, there was nothing in there that had any tie to Preston Nichols. They also threatened Preston and told him to never speak about what he saw there that day. It wasn't until 1990 that he had a breakthrough. He had been working with a Della T antenna, and this antenna is used to bend time, according to Preston. The more Preston would kind of tinker with all of these things, the more that his memories would come back, until finally it all came back to him due to this bending of time thing. In July of 1990, Preston had been laid off. All of his connections and friends also severed ties. Now, in the book, there is an editorial note regarding this whole situation from Peter Moon, and I wanted to read it from the actual book, because even though it's a lot, I could summarize it, but I really think that reading it would be better. So here goes nothing. When I met Preston Nichols, it was shortly after a huge layoff in the defense industry, and his job with AIL had been terminated. Around Long Island Psychotronics, it was no secret that he had worked for AIL. When it came to the book, however, he wanted no mention of it. There were several reasons for this, at least one of which is that he did not want to anger his former employers or create a security situation for himself. Personally, I had never thought of AIL before I met Preston. For all I knew, it was a company he made up in his head. I was soon, however, to be disabused of this idea, and only by rather strange reasons that naturally occurred in my own life. Not long after signing a formal agreement to write the Montauk project with Preston, I received a call due to some design work from Magnavox. Upon going to their building, I was shocked to see that it was adjacent to a rather huge campus for Airborne Instruments Laboratory, or AIL. Although it is not such a big deal, it was as if the company itself was being imprinted upon my consciousness as important of things to come. Not too long afterwards, I decided to join a writing club to sharpen up my writing skills and was directed to a lady named Charlene. She invited me to her house one evening where there would be a gathering of writers, all of whom were aspiring to some sort of literary success. To my surprise, bordering an alarm, there was a huge radio antenna on the house. As I was the first one at the gathering, Charlene directed me to her living room to wait, where I promptly noticed a certificate that prominently featured AIL. What was this? I wondered. Charlene explained that her husband worked for AIL. As she was also a little familiar with what I was working on, she suggested I wait until her husband got home, which would be around 11 o'clock. His name is Dick Knadel, and to my surprise, he knew Preston Nichols pretty well. In fact, he had worked with him, heard his stories about Montauk, and even visited Camp Hero in an attempt to investigate Preston's claims. The large antenna was a ham radio antenna. Dick, however, was not a supporter of Preston's claims. His main argument, however, was that Preston was not an engineer, but simply a technician. How could he possibly be qualified to participate in such a project? Preston soon explained to me that he actually did secure an engineering diploma from the University of Tampa, but it was given on the basis of a series of challenge exams where you established that you had the equivalent knowledge thereof. Preston had gone to school previously at Brooklyn Polytech, where he quit after being disgusted with his professor for stealing his work. Preston was and is a genius and has always been far ahead of his peers when it comes to technical matters. He said that he never let human resources know about his engineering diploma, as it was more advantageous for him to work as a tech due to the fact that he would receive generous overtime pay. Although Dick could not get on board with Preston's strange theories about the Montauk Project, he did mention one rather remarkable oddity concerning Preston. He said that although AIL typically had a very strict dress code, it did not apply at all to Preston. In fact, he said it was as if Preston had no regard for the dress code whatsoever. This clearly indicates that Preston was considered extremely valuable. If he was a mundane technician, he would have been summarily fired for such. In this chapter, Preston also mentions a high security room at AIL, which appeared to have strange coil structures and was part of Project Moonbeam. At a book signing one evening, a man showed up who worked as a security guard at AIL. When he was told about this particular area and read about it in the book, he said he knew the exact location. Although he asked about it, he found out that it was indeed a high security area, and he knew better than to pursue it further. Although the project in this chapter is referred to as Project Moonbeam, that was not the original name. It was actually Project Moonstruck. Preston was adamant about not using the actual name in the book. When I asked him why, he said that he did not want to piss off Dick Knadel. He said that Dick was over him in the organizational structure of the Montauk Project and that he led a secret life. Based upon my own conversations with Dick, I cannot verify Preston's claims. It is extremely coincidental, however, how all of these corroborative bits of experience landed in my lap, particularly when I was not looking for them. There was another bizarre coincidence, which was perhaps even more to the point. When I actually had completed the manuscript for this book and had the typesetting done, I looked for a local printer who could turn the book into a short order. When I finally found one that was willing to work on a fast turnaround, I visited the plant to meet the sales lady, who promptly took me into the press room where there was a huge stacks of promotional material, all of which prominently displayed AIL, one of their primary clients. This was very weird. It demonstrated, however, that what I was dealing with was very close to home. Keep in mind, Long Island is 120 miles with millions of people and numerous printers and defense contractors. The pattern of coincidences being played out was more than odd. I eventually had the book printed in the Midwest, as the prices were much more reasonable, even when one factored in the shipping. It is now over 25 years since the Montauk Project Experiments in Time hit the bookshelves. It is hard to convey how challenging it was to compile the information and publish the actual book. There was considerable mental opposition from others with regard to disseminating Preston's story, which was, after all, a controversial account of what he could muster up from repressed memories. It was like working in the shadow of Goliath, or a great beast that everyone was denying the existence of, but were also afraid to admit that it might not only exist, but was influencing their lives. Something that I have heard spoken about so much, especially recently, is that of the government controlling the weather and chemtrails, all of that kind of stuff. This, even though I've seen it spoken about more now, it's nothing new. You can think that it's a weird conspiracy theory or you can believe it, whatever. That is your prerogative. You believe or don't believe whatever you want. But this theory is something that actually stems from Wilhelm Reich and the Phoenix Project, which later would absorb Project Rainbow. In the late 1940s is when the United States government started a weather control project, and both the information and technology came from an Austrian scientist by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Reich. Dr. Reich also studied with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Preston Nichols describes Dr. Reich as extremely brilliant, but also controversial. Preston also stated that many of Dr. Reich's critics were not able to look at his findings and research, partially because the FDA supervised a massive book burning of all of his research and his laboratory. I know, this may seem kind of far-fetched, but is it really? Maybe controlling the weather is less believable for most, but the burning of information that the government doesn't want out there is a little bit more believable. At least to me it is. And while it may not have happened here, I would not be surprised if it's happened with other things that us non-government officials aren't supposed to know about. Anyway, Dr. Reich was known for his discovery of orgone energy, which is orgasmic or life energy. According to Preston Nichols, quote, his experiments revealed orgone energy to be distinctly different from ordinary electromagnetic energy. He was able to prove the existence of this energy in the laboratory. His findings were written up in various psychiatric and medical journals of the period. The discovery of a type of energy called orgone was not so controversial. It became very controversial with the powers that be when he reported curing cancer with his theories. He also associated orgone energy with cosmic energy and the Newtonian concept of the ether. None of these views won him support from conventional scientists of the 1940s. At the turn of the century, scientists had embraced the Newtonian ether. This referred to a hypothetical, invisible substance that was postulated to pervade all space and serve as a medium for light and radiant energy. Einstein, who embraced the theory in his early years, eventually determined that there could not be a calm ether through which matter moves. Not all physicists bought Einstein's argument, but Reich didn't disagree. He pointed out that Einstein disproved the concept of a static ether. Reich considered the ether to be wave-like in nature and not static at all. Something that Dr. Reich would go on to find in his studies is that violent storms accumulated dead orgone energy, and he started calling it DOR. Dr. Reich found that this DOR existed in not just violent storms, but in people and environments. So, an example of this would be an active and happy go-getter would have good orgone energy, while a complaining hypochondriac would have DOR, which I can see where he was coming from with something like this to a point. In the late 1940s, Dr. Reich contacted the government, and according to Preston Nichols, despite what we've heard, the government actually thought Dr. Reich was a brilliant man and asked to see his prototypes and things of the like. There were different devices that they used to collect data on the weather. Remember when I talked about the Philadelphia experiment just a little while ago? It's when the USS Eldridge disappeared and reappeared in a different spot, and then some crew members were fused to the ship while others had been so traumatized that they were considered mentally unfit. Okay, well, Project Rainbow, which as I stated earlier, was absorbed by the Phoenix Project, and that was the code name for the operation. That was why the Philadelphia experiment even happened to begin with. Dr. John von Neumann, which I spoke about within the Philadelphia experiment portion of this video, but he had worked on the original Rainbow Project and then went on to work on something new, which was similar to that of the Rainbow Project, but their goal was to find out what went wrong with the Philadelphia experiment when it came to the people who were so horribly affected by it, and because that experiment was considered a massive failure. Dr. von Neumann was a mathematician who came to the United States from Germany. Dr. Neumann was born in Budapest in 1903, which back then was actually part of Austria. But back to Dr. Neumann and the Montauk Project part of this video. He became a theoretical physicist and was known for his advanced concepts of space and time. So this next portion, I want to read from Preston Nichols' book about Dr. von Neumann, and it says, as von Neumann began work on the Phoenix Project, he quickly learned that he was going to have to study metaphysics. He had to understand the metaphysical side of man. The rainbow technology had dissolved the physical and biological structure of human beings. People were stuck in bulkheads and changed beyond recognition in some cases. But it was the aristoric workings of the mind that had been affected first in each case. Von Neumann and his team spent about 10 years working out why human beings had troubles with electromagnetic fields that shifted them through different places and times. They actually found out that humans are born with what is known as a time reference point. At conception, an energy being is attached to a timeline, and we all start from that point. To understand this, it is necessary to view the energy being, or soul, as distinct from the physical body of the person concerned. Our whole reference as a physical and metaphysical being stems from that time reference, which actually resides within the electromagnetic background of our planet. This time reference is the basic orientation point you have to the universe and the way it operates. You can imagine how you would feel if the clock suddenly started moving backwards and time as well. It is this time reference point that was thrown out of the kilter with the individual crewmen of the USS Eldridge and caused them untold trauma. The Rainbow Technology and the Phoenix Project, from my understanding on how Preston Nichols explained it, was they were trying to create an alternate reality of some sort. So if they were trying the Philadelphia experiment a second time, they could not only isolate the ship, but the human beings on it as well, so that they could survive and be coherent and aware of what is going on. Dr. von Neumann was also chosen because of his experience and knowledge with computers at the time. Something that gets brought up is there is the physical being and the spiritual being when it comes to humans. Preston Nichols said that the time reference in the computer would lock in the spirit and the electromagnetic background would lock in the body. The project started in 1948 and was finally developed in 1967. Once everything was all done, a report of all of the research and findings was sent to Congress. Well, in 1969, they were ordered to disband the entire project because Congress was too worried that if the wrong people were to get their hands on all of this information, they themselves could lose their minds and be controlled. If all of this is true, it truly doesn't surprise me. So let's learn how to control minds, but then shut down the program to do so because we don't want to be controlled. I can see why a lot of people believe these theories because while some of it is very outlandish and questionable, especially without proof, but some would actually make sense. I mean, the CIA did go through with MKUltra. When the Phoenix Project was shut down, the group that Preston Nichols calls the Brookhaven Group or Brookhaven National Labs, which seems to be in service in present day as well in 2025. But anyway, the group went to the military and told them about technology they were working on that could make an enemy surrender before any battle would start. Quote, the military became enthusiastic and were ready to cooperate. They were informed that they didn't need to get involved in the financing because that was covered by the group at Brookhaven National Labs. But the Brookhaven people needed a place where proper experimentation could be done in seclusion. They needed certain equipment and personnel from the military. They gave the military a list of all technology required, end quote. One of the things that they needed on that list was something called SAGE radar. Well, they were in luck. You might know what I'm about to say, but this is when the old decommissioned Montauk Air Force Base comes into the picture because they just so happen to have a SAGE radar system. Quote, The SAGE radar at Montauk was originally part of the early warning defense systems used during the 50s and 60s. Today, satellites and over-the-horizon radar make this technology obsolete for defense purposes. It certainly raises an important question. Even if one doesn't believe this story, why was an old, antiquated defense system turned on and utilized for a period of over 10 years? End quote. In earlier parts of Preston's book, he actually shared copies of orders that showed the base was operating during this time period that they were supposedly shut down during. Now, the whole Montauk project that we know of in this conspiracy theory was actually called Phoenix 2, which makes sense because it's basically a sequel to Phoenix 1 since Congress shut them down. Preston stated that the financing for this project was kept very private, so he doesn't know who was funding it, but some sources told him that the original funding came from the Nazis. Preston Nichols stated that the theory of funding coming from the Nazis was, quote, "In 1944, an American troop train went through a French tunnel carrying $10 billion worth of Nazi gold. This train was dynamited in the tunnel while carrying 51 GIs. General George Patton was in Europe at the time and investigated this, but he couldn't understand how an American train could be dynamited in Western Allied territory. As a general and human being, he cared about the GIs. The $10 billion was also a mystery, but Patton's efforts were blocked. I've been told this gold eventually showed up at Montauk and it was $10 billion of gold, then priced at $20 an ounce. This was the equivalent of almost $200 billion in today's currency, which, side note, this is present day in his quote, not in 2025. This was when the book was written. But anyway, it was used to finance the project initially and for years to come. After it was all spent, the project was allegedly financed by the infamous Krupp family, who controlled the ITT Corporation, end quote. According to Preston, the Krupps were owners of the German munitions factories for World War I and II. Once they were found guilty of war crimes and complicity with Hitler at the Nuremberg trials, the head of the Krupp family was paroled from a light prison sentence and allowed to continue their arms dealings. Now, that's just a simplified version. By late 1970, early 1971, the Montauk Air Force Base was coming back to life. And by late 1971, the Montauk Project had begun. Preston Nichols would be brought in to be part of the project in 1973. There were some Air Force technicians who worked on the SAGE radar in the 60s, and they told the Phoenix Project Group that they could change the general mood of the base by changing the frequency and pulse duration of the radar. This is when the Phoenix group thought that changing the pulse rate and pulse width could change the general way that people were thinking. And I'm sure it's obvious by this point that if mind control was one of their goals, they had the exact information they needed from these technicians. With this information, the Phoenix group got to work and they started running some experiments. Preston Nichols called it the microwave oven experiments because what they did was take a reflector, which is one that can be seen from a distance at Montauk Point, and they rotated it and angled it down to point at a specific spot in one of the buildings. This building would be home to the Montauk Chair, which we will get into in a little bit, but this chair was in a shielded room. Duncan Cameron, which, if you remember, is supposedly Al Bielek's brother, but from a different timeline. But Duncan was the one that would be sitting in the chair, in the Montauk Chair. While the antenna was focused on this building, the transmitter was blasting gigawatts of power. These experiments would use a transmitter, but change the different pulse rates and frequencies. Basically, what they were doing was trying to see if they could train or change brain waves. And even though the door was always closed to this shielded room with the chair, it didn't really work properly. In 1986, research showed that Duncan was brain dead. Even other psychics that did readings on Duncan said the same thing. Preston Nichols had asked a neurologist friend if it was possible that someone could be brain dead but still walking around, and he stated that yes, it was possible. Since Duncan was a psychic, that's what was keeping him alive and strong. Supposedly, the way that this worked was Duncan's psychic part of his mind took over the physical part, and that was what was keeping his body going. Well, by 1972 to 1973, they started seeing that this technology dealt with non-burning radiation. So what they decided to do was take the antenna and turn it 180 degrees and then aimed the burning rays into the sky and hit the person with the non-burning rays. That would be when they would see the mood-altering things in their human subjects. Since the base had a gym and a bowling alley and things of that nature, sometimes different military units were invited to come to the base for a little bit of R&R. And I mean, Montauk was in a beautiful location, so it would have been an invitation that no one would really bat an eye at. Basically, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't look like a scary place where they would, have experiments going on. But anyway, the military personnel that was invited had no idea that they were actually being used in an experiment with the mood-altering technology. Military personnel weren't the only ones being experimented on. Civilians who lived in Montauk, along with Long Island, New Jersey, upstate New York, and Connecticut were also tested on to see how far the technology could reach, but the soldiers were the ones who were a main focus. Now we move on to the Montauk Chair, and the Montauk Chair had a sensor technology that was developed in the 1950s. There is science behind it, of course, but the long story short is the technology was a mind-reading machine, and it was able to pick up electromagnetic functions of humans and then translate it either in digital form or on a screen. According to Preston Nichols, he stated that it's a mystery as to how this technology was developed, but it's believed that it was thanks to an alien race called the Syrians, who came from the star system Sirius, which, I mean, hearing about aliens isn't anything new. This is an ongoing debate on whether they exist or not. And my opinion on the matter is I truly do not believe that we are the only species out there. But do other beings look like the aliens we've seen everywhere, or do they look like E.T.? I can't comment on that because I've never seen one, but I don't think they necessarily have to look like that. But yeah, I can't believe that we're the only beings out there. Preston Nichols had joined the Montauk Chair project eventually when it was time to work with the radio frequencies and transmitter. He stated that they were experiencing issues with feedback, so they had to move the Montauk Chair. They ended up moving the chair to Southampton, Long Island. A psychic would sit in the chair, and then the information would be sent to the Montauk transmitter. The way Preston Nichols described it was that the psychic would have their thoughts, and then one of the computers would decode what they were thinking. It took a few years to work on the technology to get it better, but then they had run into a problem in about 1979. Quote, "If there was a glitch in the flow of time in our reality, everything fell apart. In other words, if the psychic in the chair projected a reality in terms of time in this case that was not consistent with our reality, the flow of time in our reality, it would cause the connection between Southampton and Montauk to break up. Any glitch in space and time between the two cities would cause the transmission of the thought form to cease. To better understand a time glitch, imagine time as a continuous pulsation or flow. As the basic pulsation of time interacts and changes form with other flows or phenomena, we have motion as we know it, against the backdrop of time, when these core pulsations that make up time are shifted due to a reality change or other phenomena. The direction, speed, or flow of the time is changed. This is what is known as the time glitch. Theoretically, these occur every now and then, and since we are referenced in our reality, we really don't notice a time glitch. Deja vu phenomena could well be an example of a glitch in the fabric of time." End quote. In order to reduce these interferences and time glitches with the Montauk Chair, they needed to bring the Montauk Chair back to Montauk. However, at the same time, they needed to change a few things in order for the chair to not be affected by Montauk's electromagnetic fields. What they found was working was a coil structure and the receivers that was designed by Nikola Tesla. They also needed to replicate what crystal receivers did with the Syrian technology, and I mean actual crystals and the Syrians as in the aliens. But notice how Nikola Tesla and the aliens and stuff get brought up in Preston Nichols' story, just like Al Bielek's. But anyway, basically from my understanding, they needed materials like the crystal receivers and the technology of Nikola Tesla for the coil structure. Eventually, the chair was up and running on Montauk grounds, and it was actually underground in the basement of the transmitter building in a shielded room. I know I've spoken about Duncan Cameron quite a number of times so far throughout this entire video, and he was actually able to start making objects appear almost out of thin air. This all started happening in 1977 when the transmitter was finally working with no glitches, and they wanted to see how far they could take this. Well, Duncan would start concentrating on a solid object and it would just appear on the base. Even with making these objects appear, sometimes it would only be visible to you, but you wouldn't be able to actually touch it or hold it. And then other times it would be stable enough to stay and was a real object that you could touch. Sometimes these objects would only stick around if the transmitter was turned on. There was another experiment that they had Duncan test out, and that was the seeing eye experiment. This is where he would have a lock of someone's hair or something that belonged to a person, and he would concentrate on said person. He would do this to try and see through their eyes, hear through their ears, and feel through their body. According to Preston Nichols, this experiment was successful, but he had no idea how extensive it was. Now, if this is something that happened or if this is something that people can do in the future, it's actually really invasive and really concerning. It's one thing to control people's minds, which again is not right, but taking over their bodies too is just pure insanity. The next step was to see if Duncan can control how these people were thinking, and he would do this by meeting a person, and then he would concentrate on this person so much that he would get into their mind and control what they were saying. Remember how in the beginning of the video I talked about the people of Montauk and them saying that animals were acting weird, or the police having to deal with crime within only a certain window of time? Apparently that was done with this type of experimentation with Duncan. You might be wondering, how could Duncan Cameron perform all of these experiments and not feel weird about it or not feel as though it was unethical to be doing these types of things? Well, here's the reason for it. Quote, "One must realize that when Duncan did these experiments, he was in an altered form of consciousness. He had been given special training, which could possibly have been administered by the CIA or NSA. In any event, his conscious mind would be diverted through sexual bliss. What could be termed the primitive mind would then surface. Duncan, the individual, would be transferred into an orgasmic trance. His primitive mind, at the disposal of the researchers, became very suggestible and therefore controllable. For this programming, information could be installed via any of the body's senses. Duncan would then be directed to have his primitive mind concentrate on the information thus installed." End quote. By 1978, all of these mind control techniques were completely developed and recorded, and the records would be given to different agencies to see where they would go from there. By 1979, after continuing the experiments, Duncan was able to time warp and bend time. An example that was shared was Duncan would concentrate on something at 8 p.m. and then the object or event would happen hours later at midnight or even the following morning at 6 a.m. Of course, the people involved were excited to know that Duncan could bend time. They had to start going to conferences in Olympia, Washington called Sigma conferences to learn more about time bending and time manipulation. At these conferences, they discovered that they needed to work on some more of their technology and parts of the coil. Well, this is when they would introduce another antenna that Preston referred to as the Orion Delta T antenna. The reason why it's referred to as Orion is because there was a rumor that the design was given to project by aliens from the Orion constellation, and these aliens were different from that of the Sirians I spoke about in a different part of this video. Quote, "The Orion Delta T was a huge antenna, and it was placed underground. The height was about 100 to 150 feet from point to point. Excavations were completed to about 300 feet to house the antenna under the transmitter. The Montauk Chair was placed under the transmitter and above the Delta T antenna. This was done in order to phase the above-ground RF antenna with the below-ground loop antenna so that the chair was in a null point between them. The null point was meant to cut off the interference even deeper. It knocked the interference right out of the chair completely, end quote. Eventually, they found a way to actually open portals. Duncan would concentrate on an opening in time, so for example, from 1980 to 1990, and there would be a portal that would be open in the middle of the Delta T antenna. It's been said that you could walk through it and it would remain open for as long as Duncan stayed concentrated on that time period. Preston Nichols never experienced walking through due to him being considered too valuable of a technician to travel through the portal. He stated that people would describe the portals to him, and that's how he knows that people did in fact walk through them. But once they had figured out how to stabilize this whole walking through time warps and portals thing, they kicked everyone out and cleared the entire base except for a few people. Preston Nichols was one of them that stayed along with Duncan Cameron, 2 other psychics in case something happened to Duncan, project directors, but the military left. A new team was brought in to maintain the base, but everything was super tight with security. A new technical crew was also brought in. This crew was called the Secret Crew. Real creative, I know, but that's what they were referred to as in the book. Then the project was relaunched as Phoenix 3, and this lasted from February 1981 to 1983. They were able to test things that were on the other side of the portal without ever entering it, which I'm sure was a little less unnerving for some people. And the reason why some of this could be unnerving for some people is because they did have people who would get lost within the vortex of these portals, and it was due to a glitch in the hyperspace. They did lose a lot of people, but they kept running these experiments. Something that Preston claims in his book was that they would sometimes grab people off the street, such as addicts, alcoholics, and basically people that they deemed wouldn't have a huge search party out for them, and this was so that they could do more of these experiments, and most of these people didn't make it back. This entire Montauk project can be one big elaborate fiction story, but if it's true, or if parts of it are true, such as pulling people off the streets for experiments, I would be completely saddened, but also not surprised. What is even more upsetting is, in addition to these people being used, they also use children. There was one child at Montauk who would go out and bring other kids to Montauk. The kids they chose were between 10 and 16 or maybe even 18. They usually fit the Aryan stereotype, so blonde hair, blue eyes, tall, light-skinned boys, and no girls in the group. At first I thought Preston Nichols was going to talk about the Montauk boys, which is something that unfortunately I couldn't find a lot of information on. There was an interview that I found online, but other than that, there really wasn't a lot. But from the general gist that I got about the Montauk boys was that they took a bunch of these boys and they did the whole mind control experiment on them, and then these boys went out into the world and did what they asked them to do. But that's not what Preston Nichols was talking about at this point in the book. Quote, a later investigation showed that Montauk had a neo-Nazi connection and that the Nazis were still on the Aryan kick. We don't know where the kids went, what they were educated in or programmed for. Whether they came back or not is still a mystery. What information is available is that they sent every raw recruit into the future to 6037 AD, always to the same point, to what appeared to be a dead city in ruins. Everything was stationary, not unlike a dream state. There were no signs of life. In the center of the city was a square with a gold horse on a pedestal. There were inscriptions on that pedestal, and recruits were sent there to read what they said. Each recruit would interpret and report. We still don't know what the researchers were after, end quote. Preston claims that there were a lot of people, anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people that were shoved somewhere into the future, maybe 200 or 300 years ahead. On August 5th, 1983, the team was given an order to run the transmitter nonstop. Everything was pretty normal until August 12th, where all of a sudden, the equipment somehow synced up with that of the USS Eldridge, and this was done through a portal. Supposedly, 1943 Duncan Cameron, that was actually aboard the USS Eldridge, appeared. Preston Nichols stated they kept the 1983 Duncan from seeing his 1943 version so that there weren't any effects of seeing one another that would alter whatever tests and experiments they were running. Preston Nichols stated that him and some of his co-workers were getting a little nervous about all these experiments and they decided to have a fail-safe, basically. They somehow figured out a way Duncan would crash the entire project in case something went wrong. The phrase they decided to use for this was, quote, "The time is now," end quote. So one day, someone went to Duncan and told him those 4 words because the team had decided, well, the time was now. Once this was said, Duncan had released a monster from his subconscious. This monster had been released on the base and not in the underground basement they had been running all of these tests. The monster was big, hairy, and hungry, along with being about 9 to 10 feet tall. Some said it was 30 feet tall, but I'm sure any type of monster or weird animal can feel like 30 feet tall. Preston's supervisor told him and the team to shut off the generators so that they could get these monster beast things away from everyone, and it would just disappear back into its own world or own dimension, whatever. As you can imagine, this didn't work. Well, their next idea was to shut off the transmitter. They also had to send somebody back to turn off the transmitters on the Eldridge. This was because turning off the transmitter at Montauk also didn't work. Well, at least not right away. Eventually, they were able to shut off the transmitter after many attempts of cutting power, then cutting wires. The whole 9. The beast went back to where it came from, and the portal closed. This part of the book reminds me of the part in Stranger Things where the Upside Down was seeping out and 11 had to use all of her power to close the opening. After what happened on August 12th, 1983, Montauk was emptied. The power was restored and the lights were left on, but everything was a mess. According to Preston Nichols, quote, "Most of the personnel were eventually rounded up, debriefed, and brainwashed accordingly," end quote. So what happened to Montauk? Preston Nichols said that in addition to all of the stuff I just went over in the last part, in May or June of 1984, the military was actually sent to the base and ordered to kill anything that moved because they wanted to get rid of anything or anyone that was still on the base. After that, another group of people would be brought in to take all of the equipment and all of the sensitive documentation off of the base. I'm not sure why they waited so long to collect all of this information from the time of the beast and the whole "the time is now" thing. I'm not sure why they waited so long because I feel as though people, they explore abandoned buildings and stuff all the time. So I mean, unless if there was just really, really high security there and nobody really wanted to go in there. I don't know, but I feel like they did wait a little long to get rid of sensitive information or documentation equipment and all of that. 6 months after all of that, there would be a bunch of cement mixing trucks that would come on the base and they would fill all of the underground areas, and after that the gates were closed and Montauk Air Force Base was abandoned. Well, we have officially come to the end of this series, and I'm sure that some of this sounded a little out there and a little tinfoil hat-ish, I guess you could say, whereas maybe some of it actually did make sense. And I mean, researching this, it was really interesting for me to research. I do welcome any corrections or anything that anybody wants to add to it, but I don't think we'll ever find out the truth behind the Montauk Project. I don't think that the government, if this was something that actually happened, I don't think that we'll ever know the truth, especially because Preston is no longer with us and all we have are just some personal accounts of what happened. And could this be some kind of sci-fi story? Sure, it could be. I mean, this is, if it is, this is the works of a brilliant mind and a very creative mind, in my opinion. But I mean, that can also be the case as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of this is true or not true or whatever. I mean, you can believe whatever you want. I don't really know what to believe. I believe that the government doesn't tell us things, and I believe that there are things, unethical things, that allegedly happen behind the scenes that we don't know about and that we will never know about. So who's to say that some, if not all, of the stuff that I talked about in this series is true or false? I mean, I really don't know. So it's kind of a toss up, and you can let me know what you think of all of this. I hope that you enjoyed this series. I know that this was kind of all over the place, but I'm going to be really honest with all of you. I had so much fun researching this video, and I haven't felt this excited about a topic on my channel in a long time, because don't get me wrong, I love making all the videos that I make on my channel, but this was probably one of my favorite topics to cover in a few years. I did also just want to say I apologize for being gone for so many months. This series actually took a long time for me to research and put together and find the time to film and all of that. But on top of that, there were a lot of things that were happening behind the scenes. I actually, over the summer, ended up going to the dentist and getting my first ever fillings done. And not like many of you probably care about this, but the dentist messed up. And they actually created some nerve damage in my teeth because they did the fillings incorrectly. So I had to have all 4 of my wisdom teeth pulled. So I was dealing with a lot of pain all summer in my mouth. And so then I had my teeth pulled. And then after I got my teeth pulled, we had family in town. And it has just been a crazy couple of months. So that's kind of what's been going on. It's been a lot. So I just want to let everybody know I'm so sorry about that. And I'll stop rambling. Thank you so much for watching. And this is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.